My name is Arthur Hale, Chief Inspector of the Metropolitan Police, and when I look back on those months now, I can still smell the damp stone of Bloomsbury streets, mixed with ink, old paper, and the anxious expectancy of intelligent men who believed the world could be ordered by reason. Bloomsbury had been my refuge long before it became my unofficial headquarters. Not because it was quiet. London was never quiet, but because it lay close to thinking itself. Between the British Museum, the colleges, the salons, and the smoke-filled studies of professors, I found interlocutors who asked different questions than my colleagues at Scotland Yard. I needed those questions, because the man the press had christened Jack the Ripper resisted every simple explanation. On the morning that altered everything, I stood before the museum's great portico, my coat drawn tight, as fog drifted like a sullen philosopher between the columns. Inside, Professor Elwood Finch was waiting for me, historian, logician, and, as he liked to say, a friend of inconvenient hypotheses. Inspector, he began, without greeting as we walked through the galleries. You are not hunting a murderer. You are hunting a structure. I replied that structures rarely had blood on their hands. Finch smiled thinly. And yet, he said, blood is often merely the visible consequence of an invisible order. That was why I kept returning to Bloomsbury. We sat in his study, books stacked in precarious equilibrium around us. I told him of Whitechapel, of the alleys, of the methodical cruelty of the crimes. Methodical, he repeated thoughtfully. That word tells you more about the perpetrator than 100 witness statements. He rose, pulled a volume from the shelf, opened it at random. A man who kills methodically is no slave to impulse. He follows rules, perhaps even aesthetic ones. I objected, called it madness. Finch raised a finger. Madness is not the opposite of intelligence, Inspector. Often it is its shadow. Such conversations continued day after day in Bloomsbury, over tea, over poor coffee, sometimes over a glass of sherry as night drew in. I spoke with linguists about the language of the letters, with physicians about incisions and precision, with philosophers about morality and transgression. Once Professor Margaret Vale, a woman of razor-sharp intellect, said to me, "Perhaps this man horrifies us so deeply because he forces us to admit that education and barbarism are not opposites." I walked the streets for hours afterward, past laughing students and flickering gas lamps, wondering whether Jack the Ripper himself had once walked here, a young man with books under his arm and abysses in his mind. The official investigation ran in parallel, sober, numerical, often barren. My superiors tolerated my excursions into Bloomsbury, so long as I produced results. But results were elusive when one's adversary was a specter, fed by fear and sensation. In another conversation, Finch asked me abruptly, "Have you considered that the killer reads your reports?" I nodded. "Then," he continued, "you are already engaged in a dialogue with him. The question is only who speaks the more intelligent sentences." The thought would not leave me. Investigation as intellectual duel, as chess played in fog. I began to phrase my reports differently, more precise, less emotional. If he read them, he was to know he was taken seriously, not admired, not feared, but analyzed. In those weeks, Bloomsbury became a chamber of resonance. Every thought echoed, every theory was tested, discarded, reassembled. And yet, despite all the brilliance, there remained at day's end the sense that we were standing before an abyss that stared back. Late one evening, I sat alone on a bench in Russell Square. Fog drifted through the trees, and I wondered whether knowledge would save us, or merely lead us deeper into the dark. I knew only this: as long as Jack the Ripper remained at large, Bloomsbury would be my compass, a place where even the most dreadful acts were answered with thought rather than silence. It was a rainy morning in my Bloomsbury townhouse, where the wallpaper smelled faintly of dust and pipe smoke, and where ideas were treated with the same seriousness as evidence. I had been summoned by Professor Harrow, a physiologist whose lectures at University College London were reputed to unsettle even seasoned medical men. He greeted me with a firm handshake and an appraising look, as though I were a specimen rather than a guest. "Inspector Hale," he said, "you come not to ask what the killer does, but how he thinks his body allows him to do it. I answered that bodies left traces, and that minds unfortunately did the same, only in riddles. Harrow nodded approvingly and ushered me into his study. On the table lay anatomical sketches, precise to the point of cruelty. The cuts, he said, without preamble, are confident, not hurried. Whoever performed them was not repulsed by the human interior. I remarked that surgeons were trained for that. Harrow smiled. So are butchers. The difference is intention. A surgeon cuts to restore order. A butcher cuts to transform matter. Your man cuts to assert mastery. That word, mastery, lodged itself in my thoughts like a splinter. Afterward, I crossed Gordon Square to meet Professor Bryce, a classicist with an interest in moral philosophy. We spoke as we walked, our breath pale in the afternoon air. The Victorians, she said, are fond of believing in progress as a straight line, but history is cyclical. Periods of refinement breed their own negations. I asked if she meant decadence. No, she replied, I mean transgression as commentary. Some men commit crimes as arguments. The notion disturbed me more than any description of violence. That evening, I attended a small salon hosted by a linguist whose name never appeared in the newspapers, but whose influence could be felt in every thoughtful sentence uttered in Bloomsbury. Over sherry, we discussed the letters attributed to the killer. Notice the spelling, the linguist said. Deliberately inconsistent, a mask. He wants to appear crude, but the syntax betrays education. Another guest interjected, or perhaps contempt, for both the police and the public. I found myself speaking more than I intended, outlining the pattern of the murders, the intervals, the geography. Silence followed. Then the host said quietly, "He is writing a text on the city, Inspector. The murders are his punctuation." I left late, my head heavy with borrowed thoughts. Walking back through the squares, I considered how Bloomsbury, with its books and lectures and earnest debates, formed an unlikely counterpoint to the filth of Whitechapel. Yet both were parts of the same organism. The next morning brought a meeting with Finch again. He listened as I recounted the previous day's conversations. "You are building a composite," he said. "Not a profile, but a chorus." I asked whether choruses caught killers. Finch shrugged. "Sometimes they teach us why catching them matters." News arrived of another body shortly thereafter. Duty pulled me east, away from Bloomsbury's measured calm, into the raw immediacy of horror. Still, even as I stood over the corpse, I heard the professor's voices in my head, translating gore into hypothesis, chaos into structure. Back in my office that night, I wrote my report carefully, every word weighed. I imagined an unseen reader tracing my sentences, judging their acuity. This, I realized, was no longer merely an investigation. It was an exchange. Dangerous, abstract, and relentlessly intellectual. Bloomsbury had taught me that much. I found myself not in Bloomsbury but in Whitechapel, with a knock on my door before dawn, and a constable whose face had already resigned itself to what he carried. Another woman, another alley, another arrangement of brutality that felt less like chaos and more like composition. I rode east in silence, the city unspooling outside the carriage window, order giving way to squalor. Whitechapel greeted me with its familiar chorus, murmurs, shudders, the wet sound of footsteps retreating from responsibility. The body lay in a narrow passage behind a lodging house, positioned with a deliberateness that chilled me more than the wounds themselves. I forced myself to look slowly. The cuts were precise, but altered, subtly so. This was not repetition, this was variation. "He's changing," muttered Sergeant Collins beside me. I did not answer. I was thinking of Professor Harrow's word, mastery. Masters do not repeat themselves without reason. I noted the placement of the body, the angle relative to the street, the proximity to a lamppost whose light barely reached the ground. And then I saw it, a scrap of paper, folded once, deliberately placed in the victim's hand. Not taunting, not concealed, offered. Back at the station, the paper revealed itself to be no confession, no crude verse, but a quotation, Latin, neatly written. I recognized it before I translated it fully. Ordo ab chao. Order from chaos. Bloomsbury rushed back into my mind like a tide. This was not for the newspapers. This was not even for the police at large. This was for someone who could read it. Someone who would recognize that phrase as more than ornament. I returned west as soon as protocol allowed, the city now inverted in my thoughts. At the British Museum Library, Finch listened as I described the scene. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he said only, "Then he has begun to speak plainly." We were joined later by Professor Bryce and Harrow, summoned with a brevity that suggested urgency rather than courtesy. I laid out the facts, the quotation, the deviation in method. Bryce's eyes narrowed. "Order from chaos," she said, "a favorite of Enlightenment thinkers, also of certain secret societies, and of men who believe themselves architects rather than criminals," Harrow added. Finch leaned back. "You see," he said to me, "this is no longer mere display. He is signaling alignment." Alignment with what? The question hung between us. We debated for hours. Philosophy, anatomy, history, intersecting in uncomfortable ways. At one point, Bryce said quietly, "If he believes he is restoring order, then his victims are not random. They are selected." That thought struck harder than any gore. Selected implied criteria. Criteria implied predictability. I asked Finch where such thinking most commonly gestated. He gestured around us. "Here," he said, "in places where abstraction becomes intoxicating." The realization settled with slow dread. The killer was not merely moving through London. He was moving through ideas, and Bloomsbury, for all its civility, was part of his map. I left the library that night with a fragile thread of hope woven through my fear. If he believed in order, then he believed in sequence, and sequences, once understood, can be interrupted. Somewhere between Whitechapel's darkness and Bloomsbury's light, a solution had begun to take shape, not yet visible but no longer inconceivable. I returned to Bloomsbury with a different purpose, less to think and more to listen. The theories were beginning to crowd each other out, and I had learned the hard way that too much intellect can dull the senses. Evening had settled in, and with it the softer, more human side of the district. Lamps glowed behind steamed windows, and the streets filled with the low murmur of voices seeking warmth, drink, and forgetfulness. I stepped into a small bar just off Great Russell Street, a place favored by clerks, junior lecturers, and men who wanted to feel learned without having to prove it. The air was thick with tobacco and ale. I ordered a whiskey and took a seat at the counter, letting the room come to me. Conversations overlapped. Complaints about exams, laughter over politics, the clink of glasses marking time better than any clock. After a while, a man 2 stools down leaned toward me. He had the look of someone who talked too much when given encouragement and too little when it mattered. "You're not from around here," he said, eyeing my coat. I told him I spent enough time in Bloomsbury to know its habits. He chuckled. "Then you've probably seen him." I asked who he meant. The man took a drink, lowered his voice. "There's a fellow comes in now and then, quiet, well-spoken, doesn't drink much, always sits alone, watching, asks odd questions." I felt my attention sharpen. "What kind of questions?" I asked. "About people," he said. "Where they're from, what they do." Once he asked me whether I thought London was sick or just misunderstood. I asked when he had last seen this man. 2 nights ago, he replied, right after the papers were shouting about another killing. He didn't look surprised, more satisfied. The words settled uneasily between us. I pressed him for a description, and he gave me one that was frustratingly ordinary. Average height, neat appearance, educated speech. The kind of man who vanished into a crowd by belonging perfectly to it. As the night wore on, another patron joined in, overhearing just enough to be curious. "If it's the same man," she said, "he was here last week too. Left early. Said he had a long walk ahead of him." She gestured vaguely east. Whitechapel. I finished my drink slowly. This was no grand revelation, no elegant theory. Just a man, a bar, and a pattern of presence. but it was the first hint that the killer moved through ordinary spaces, listened as much as he acted, and left traces not of brilliance, but of habit. When I stepped back into the night, Bloomsbury felt smaller, more vulnerable. The solution was no longer an abstraction. It was somewhere between a bar stool and a dark street, waiting to be followed. The next days unfolded with a weary momentum, as if London itself were reluctant to move forward. I carried the barroom description with me, like a half-remembered face in a dream. It was not much, no name, no address, but it was enough to change how I worked. I stopped chasing theories and began watching routines. Whitechapel demanded my presence again before the week was out. Another body, this time closer to a main thoroughfare, as though the killer were testing how visible he could become. The wounds were familiar now, but there was a restraint to them that unsettled me. He could have done more. He had chosen not to. That choice mattered. I walked the perimeter slowly, noting the foot traffic, the nearby public houses, the routes a man might take without drawing attention. Habit, I reminded myself, always betrays itself eventually. Back west, I retraced my evenings. The bar near Great Russell Street became a regular stop, though I never made it obvious why I was there. I listened, drank little, and learned which nights attracted which kinds of men. On the third visit, the bartender nodded toward a corner table and said quietly, "Your quiet fellow sat there once. Didn't stay long, paid in exact change." Exact change. Another small thing. But killers are built of small things. I asked if he spoke to anyone. "Only once," the bartender said. "Asked a man what time the museum closed. That was it." The museum, Bloomsbury again. Not as an idea, but as a place with doors and hours and guards who grew bored. I requested access logs under the pretense of routine security concerns. It took time, favors, and more patience than I cared to admit, but eventually patterns emerged. A man fitting the description had visited repeatedly, always alone, always late in the day, always leaving just before closing. I stood one afternoon in the museum's central hall, watching the flow of visitors. Students drifted in groups, scholars walked with purpose, and then there were the solitary men, unremarkable, moving slowly, observing without being seen. I realized then that the killer did not rush, because he did not need to. He trusted his understanding of people more than his speed. That evening, Finch asked me if I was any closer. I told him yes, though not in the way he expected. "He's ordinary," I said. "Too ordinary." Finch frowned, then nodded. "That," he replied, "is often the most dangerous kind." For the first time, I believed I might meet Jack the Ripper face to face. Not in a dark alley, but under gaslight, surrounded by civility. And when that moment came, I knew it would not feel dramatic at all. It would feel inevitable. The hint proved sufficient, not because it was clever, but because it was human. Exact change, regular hours, solitary visits. Those small habits narrowed the field faster than any theory ever had. Within days, we had a name. A clerk by profession, educated but unremarkable, employed in a position that required punctuality and rewarded invisibility. He lived alone, east of Bloomsbury, west of Whitechapel, precisely where one might pass unnoticed between both worlds. We brought him in on a gray morning, the kind that makes every face look guilty. He did not resist. In fact, he seemed relieved, as though an exhausting performance had finally ended. When I told him he was under arrest for the murders in Whitechapel, he corrected me calmly. "For restoring balance," he said. I said nothing. There was no need to argue on the street. In the interrogation room he was polite, composed, almost courteous. He spoke carefully, never raising his voice. When presented with evidence, he did not deny it. Instead, he contextualized it. "You see," he said, "the city had grown careless. I merely illustrated the cost." I asked him if he felt remorse. He considered the question seriously before answering. Remorse implies error. I made none. The trial drew crowds, though less hysteria than I expected. Perhaps people were disappointed by how ordinary he looked. The newspapers struggled to reconcile the myth with the man. On the stand, he spoke with the same measured tone he had used with me. He quoted philosophy, spoke of decay and responsibility, of order imposed where society had failed. The prosecutor dismantled his arguments methodically, returning always to the facts. The bodies, the wounds, the lives ended. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, there was no outburst. He closed his eyes, nodded once, as if a hypothesis had finally been confirmed. I watched from the back of the courtroom, feeling neither triumph nor satisfaction, only a dull finality. Outside, London continued as it always had. Bloomsbury's lamps still burned over books and arguments. Whitechapel's streets still echoed with footsteps. We had caught the man, but the city remained unchanged. As I walked away from the court, I understood something at last. The case was solved, but the conditions that allowed it had merely paused, waiting for someone else to give them shape. The hint led us to a man, and the man led us to a trial, but certainty never followed. That was the quiet truth no one wanted printed. The evidence was sufficient to persuade a jury, not sufficient to still every doubt. He was arrested without spectacle, a clerk of modest means, educated, punctual, living precisely between Bloomsbury and Whitechapel. He offered no resistance and no confession. When told of the charges, he listened with a mild, almost academic attention. "You believe you have found coherence," he said. "Belief is a useful tool." It was the last sentence he spoke outside a courtroom. In custody, he denied nothing and admitted nothing. He answered questions with answers adjacent to truth, careful and evasive without being obstructive. The Latin phrase was explained away as commonplace. The museum visits were framed as habit. The exact change as thrift. Each detail that had tightened our net could be loosened with an explanation that was plausible, if not comforting. I found myself arguing with myself in the margins of the case file. The trial unfolded under a tired public gaze. The prosecution presented patterns, routes, times, proximity, habits. They spoke of opportunity and alignment, of a man whose movements traced the murders like a shadow. The defense did not attempt brilliance. They focused on absence. No eyewitness, no definitive instrument, no confession. Suspicion, counsel said, is not proof, no matter how elegant it appears. On the stand, the accused spoke plainly. He denied the killings. He rejected the mythology built around him. "I am not the author of your fears," he said. "I am merely convenient." There was no tremor in his voice, no spark of outrage. If it was an act, it was a restrained one. The jury deliberated longer than expected. When they returned, the verdict was guilty on all counts. The courtroom exhaled. The sentence was passed. Order, at least the visible kind, was restored. He accepted it with composure, as though submitting to an equation whose premises he disputed, but whose conclusion he could not avoid. I left the court with a weight that did not lift. We had secured a conviction, yet something essential remained unresolved. The patterns fit, but patterns can deceive. Habit can mimic guilt. Intelligence can masquerade as menace, or as innocence. I could not say with the certainty I owed myself that we had ended the story. London absorbed the verdict and moved on. Bloomsbury returned to its arguments. Whitechapel returned to its nights, and I carried with me a quieter sentence than the one pronounced in court. That justice had been done according to the law, but truth had kept its distance, watching, as it often does, from the crowd. Time did what argument never could. Weeks passed, then months, and London did not bleed again. Whitechapel remained poor, loud, and dangerous in all the ordinary ways. But the pattern we had learned to dread did not return. No bodies arranged with intent, no variations masquerading as messages, no quotations, no deliberate silences. The city breathed unevenly, but it breathed. At first, I resisted the temptation to read meaning into the absence. An investigator learns early that quiet can be coincidence. Yet as the calendar turned and still nothing happened, coincidence began to look like conclusion. Newspapers that had once printed speculation in heavy ink now relegated the story to memory. Jack the Ripper, it seemed, had been contained, not by brilliance, not by revelation, but by procedure. I returned to Bloomsbury less often. When I did, the conversations had changed. Professors spoke of new lectures, new disputes. Finch remarked one afternoon, almost casually, "History prefers outcomes to uncertainties." I asked him whether he believed the court had been right. He considered this. "The law," he said, "does not require metaphysical certainty. It requires an ending." Whitechapel offered its own verdict. The fear that had once tightened every face loosened. Women walked with less urgency. Public houses stayed open later. Life resumed its usual negotiations with hardship. Whatever doubts I carried were not shared by the streets. For them, the killings had stopped, and that was proof enough. I reviewed the case file one last time before consigning it to the archive. Every detail still fit. Every objection still had an answer. And now there was the strongest evidence of all: silence. If the man we convicted had been innocent, then the true killer had chosen to vanish forever, abandoning a pattern he had constructed with care. That possibility existed, but it grew thinner with each passing day. Standing one evening on the edge of Russell Square, I accepted what time was telling us. Courts are judged not only by verdicts, but by what follows them. And what followed this one was peace of a sort. Imperfect, fragile, but real. I will never claim certainty beyond the law. That belongs to philosophers, not policemen. But the city has spoken in its own way. No more signs, no more lessons written in blood. And so as years accumulate where terror once did, we have come to believe that the court was right, not because doubt was eliminated, but because nothing rose to replace it. London moves forward, and sometimes that is the closest thing to truth we are permitted.